And now, a Native Podcast with Matt and Zach. Alrighty, everybody, welcome back. Episode 2, numero dos. Matt buddy, Zach here. How are you doing, Matt buddy? Let's start it off right.
I'm doing pretty good, my man. Pretty good out here in Portland, Oregon area right now. And this is our last day of clouds, it looks like. The sun is coming. So
good. It's summer up there in the Pacific Northwest. It's great to hear. I'm excited. I'm excited for you and all the fun adventures you get to go on out in the Pacific Northwest, all the salmon cultures you get to see, all the powwows out there. I think you said you're going to Siletz or Grand Ronde this fall as well.
Yeah, they're back-to-back weekends. So usually what I do, I try to, like, if I go to Siletz one year, I'll go to Grand Ronde the next. Or if I got things going on, depending on which weekend I'm free, I'll go make a trip out of it, go camp at the coast if it's at Siletz, or if it's at Grand Ronde, maybe stay with my buddy. He sets up a teepee every year. So yeah.
No, that's exciting. No, it's exciting to see Indian country, Native America, North America, Turtle Island getting into it, whatever you want to call it. Kind of just to get into the meat, because this episode, I think today is a meaty episode. As you were saying, early on, there's a lot to talk about here. This is a can of worms, because the topic, if you read the title, says, what is a Native American? And I don't know how many of you have been asked that question in your lives, or had it come up, or had the discussion with someone. And this is something me and Matt, I mean, we've gone back and forth, what is that definition? But how do you get the conversation even started? We talk about, like, even the terminology, Indigenous, American Indian, Native American, all socially accepted across Indian country, for that matter. I feel like you hear them, Indigenous, Native American, American Indian, all referenced, Indian country referenced, all that. So it's kind of interesting when you get into what that may be. Matt, any just first words?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a loaded question. I mean, for real, like, that could go many different directions. Even Indian, or like, just that term, it has a more negative connotation. But at the same time, you go to the res and there's elders like, we're Indians, like.
Well, and that's the official term the U.S. government, the United States government, uses, is American Indian. When you fill out the census form, when you look at any government data that, like the FDA publishes, or CDC, or the White House, it's American Indian is how they, or other, don't forget, we also get looped into the other category.
Other or something else, or
But that's kind of what it is. It's
don't know what you are.
But it's interesting because you get those names and you get, like, the modern day, you see that with the youth, right? Yeah, the Gen Xers, the Gen Zers, the millennials. You're starting to really see the term Indigenous be used more, which to me comes from the Canadian, just First Peoples, and how they refer to themselves as Indigenous is where you really, I think, where I've heard the term, I guess.
Oh yeah, and I think there is this greater movement right now. We talk about Turtle Island, right? And I just posted something about the turtle today on Facebook, and how the turtle's like holding itself up, or like it holds others up. Like, it's kind of like we're all sitting on a turtle shell in North America, and that does include Indigenous people in Canada, US, and Mexico even. And so, like, that now there's a movement toward the, like, if you're Indigenous to North America, that's the term they're trying to use.
Right. And then it's interesting because when you go to the Museum of the Native American Indian, right? Yeah, because even the Smithsonian Museum of Native American, is it Native American or American Indian? I think it's American Indian.
It's American Indian as well, like you're saying, the government terminology. But yeah,
In DC there, the Smithsonian, beautiful museum. It's interesting because there's some old quotes that they have where people are talking about
Oh, sorry.
the Americans, referring to the native people as the Americans. You
Oh,
know,
that's an
early,
interesting.
early on in the
Right.
days, which
Yeah.
makes how the terms would evolve into like Native American being common, because it's saying like, no, you're native to this land that we call America. Whereas like over time, the US citizens bought into, no, we're Americans because we were born here. This is our right to this land as well. And as manifest destiny and all that carried out, those terminologies, it's interesting how you look at little things like that and how they're kind of used throughout history and how they change and adapt over time. Because you know, it's interesting. It's just it's we call ourselves one thing, and then you're even seeing tribes nowadays, like the Flathead tribe. You're seeing them go more towards the Salish Kootenai terminology and away from the Flathead terminology. Uh,
Right.
because of just the misconceptions with language barriers and whatnot. And tribes going, like, even we were talking about that, the Jemez Pueblo, like the Wapatoa is really their true name. Um,
Yeah.
and how that is. So there's all these different movements, but regardless, I think, of what you call it, those kind of terms to me are what you'll hear: Indigenous, American Indian, Native Americans, all kind of that Indian country. It's all kind of one. And I like to group, we always group Alaska into it with the US, sure. But I also like to group the Hawaiians,
Yeah.
just based on their struggles as well, sometimes because of how the US government really did treat them in relations to.
Well, the fact that they're kind of in this weird, they get left out of things. Sometimes they're included with other Pacific Islanders, but that's a whole other thing because like Tonga is its own country, but American Samoa is like the Hawaiians in a sense, they're a territory of the US. So they're kind of in this weird thing, but arguably the native Hawaiians, they spent time along the Oregon coast. They
Oh,
spent time here on the mainland with other tribes, and it's like,
exactly. There's documentations of Hawaiian bird feathers in burial mounds in
right,
Ohio, meaning those trade routes, those trade centers
that's
exist.
that's crazy how far that is too. And like people think, well, how is that possible? Well, right here in Oregon, in Eastern Oregon, there's the Owyhee River. And doing research, Owyhee, oh, that sounds indigenous, right? Well, it is, but it's not indigenous from there. It's a Hawaiian word
Oh,
from the early Hawaiian explorers that came out to Fort Vancouver. And they basically went on, they some of them became trappers and
right.
and,
Well,
and work and yeah.
who's to say if there's feathers in Ohio, how does a person not end up there either? Get off the boat and start wandering and walking, and learning this new land and trading. There's Blackfeet stories about going down to Mexico.
Right. Well, or marrying into like other tribes, right? And yeah, there is that Blackfeet one is interesting to me because that you're talking about the eagle condor kind of thing.
Right.
And what's interesting about that is during the Standing Rock pipeline encampment, the Sacred Stone Camp, I believe is what they called it. But there's kind of like that, their story came out about the eagle and condor meeting again there because this time there's indigenous people from down south that came to that camp.
Right. To
It's
help.
like in reverse, like they came north this time because the Blackfeet went south a long time ago, right?
Right. No,
Or in an individual manner, however the story was, but uh,
right.
people traveled a long distance.
Well, and if anyone knows that story that Matt is referencing and wants to share that story, please give us an email at gng@gng.net. That is the letter G as in garden gnome, the letter N as in Nome, Alaska, the letter G again, and then .net, gng@gng.net. The N is also Nancy for the military code speakers, N as in Nancy. Let us know. But I guess a good way to break down Indian country as a whole. When you start, you get that big question, like we said, what is a Native American, right? You kind of talk about the terminology, you talk about the peoples, the indigenous peoples to the Turtle Island, right? And I like to break it down, especially when you get into the United States here. Um, you have your Native Hawaiians, you have your Native Alaskans, you have the Pacific Northwest, which arguably ranges from Yurok, California. I would argue up to like Juneau, Alaska, even when you talk about some of the salmon culture traditions. Uh,
Right.
when you talk about like the relation of like some of those Alaskan villages versus like the ones up like on the tundra, it's a little bit different where there's more similarities to the coastal people.
Well,
But
it's
go
yeah.
ahead.
Oh, it is like you're saying that Southeast Alaska. The areas where it rains a lot are
Right.
also a good indicator with the forest and meeting the coast is also a great indicator of what you're saying, like for coastal culture.
Well, and arguably you see maps that they'll include the Flathead tribe in Montana and the Idaho tribes in that northwest region as well. So when you look at like the Oregon, Washington, Idaho kind of Flathead, and then northern, I would include Northern California, but you could argue California own region as well as Nevada, but typically I would group California and Nevada together.
Yeah, and you were hitting on something in the Northwest is like regionally we would include like Oregon, Washington, Idaho, sometimes northern half of California. But then you look at cultural regions, and those can sometimes be a little different. Like
Right.
plateau, the Columbia Plateau, you could argue is a combination of plains and Northwest coast culture, like intermixed.
Exactly, and that's arguably why that some of those Columbia Plateau tribes can come over to the Three Forks area, the Montana area, the Yellowstone area, and come hunt bison.
Right. Like, because salmon was still their biggest thing, but yet they supplemented it. Arguably, they had a lot of options for food in that sense.
But
Because
when you look
we're
at
in-
that spot, they did, and in a
yeah,
way, I think I think when you look at the dams, you look at the way we suck up water off this land and kind of just hurt the land as
mm,
society does now. If you take Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, some of those larger like Washington cities out of the tri-cities, I think that landscape looks a little bit more lush. And
oh,
when you look at like the Sahara and stuff of Africa, like
right.
more like vibrant and lush and has its true seasons and really like in August one time I was driving back in Washington and I hit a bunch of grasshoppers and I'm like, back in the day, man, you can only imagine swarms like these. Um, and what that did to the field because you're not farming the fields either.
Well, and you saw that time of year how dry it gets out there, like when the grass and the farms are all dried up in Eastern Washington. And
But see, you're not pulling that much water back in the day for
yeah.
farms and stuff. So it's a different landscape and it's a different type of grass even. So
Well, they're not tilling that soil, so the soil it probably maintains more moisture longer, like
right.
in greenery, like you're saying.
Well, and to me, it created. I bet you it was an Eden of some sort. When you look at that
Oh
region,
yeah. No,
uh,
that plateau region. I mean, I've gone elk hunting in the Blue Mountains of Oregon,
right?
and arguably, I'm like, why don't more people live out here? It's beautiful. There's no
Like,
one that lives there hardly in the Umatilla peoples. I'm like, wow, you guys had salmon and the mountains for hunting. Like, but
right. And that's the thing is people look at that land and and no one's out there and it's like, oh, the reservation's on the shitty land. It's because like, well, yeah, the US government put the reservation on the shitty land. Like that's
right,
what like right next to the beautiful mountains, the beautiful
right.
valley, all that,
That's
right?
probably the lands that like native folks just traveled through. We're like, yeah, we don't have any resources here. So they didn't use it, like
Well, and when you talk about the bison and where it was even arguably out there on the Columbia Plateau at times, that's a field of grass that the bison would be grazing in, and you just follow them through it in the summer seasons or in the spring, falls, season, and you'd winter where you'd winter. But and then so then we look at like I said, the California region because you have the like rancherias, and Nevada because you have the Indian colonies. Those are kind of similar, just how they are established and set up and kind of govern themselves. but it's different. Each state is different because of the state laws that
Yeah.
the tribes. But when you talk about grouping them together, sometimes it's easy to group Nevada either into the Southwest or California. And the Southwest I like to get into is Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado.
Right.
Especially because those Colorado tribes are down below, kind of in the western region of
They
the
they are. They're all from the what they call the cliff dweller culture in that region. And that's how, like, those four states, like you just said, is how I like to group them as well, because the Anasazi, they all come from that culture far back, right? I mean,
right,
they're it's interesting. I do like the Southwest. It's very unique in
right.
its own way, right? It's very like New Mexico. When you're there, you're like, this is Southwest. Like, this is a textbook, like Southwest.
Oh, exactly. And you look at and you get that feel, and you have the pueblos there, which even kind of varies from like the Arizona tribes, um, which is interesting because you even like look at like the casinos down in the Southwest that you have, and the fact that like there's no open gaming or any of those kind of things going on in those states. So those casinos can thrive and grow large. So like people think like you go down like Sandia Pueblo in Albuquerque there, like you're saying, it's textbook Southwest. It's a resort in the desert. You know what I mean? In a way.
I
Uh,
think another part of the Southwest I've noticed is like, look at those tribes in southern Arizona, like the Tohono O'odham that along the border there. You could argue almost that, like, and then I'm going to use the Apache on the other end. You could argue the tribes down there were either more of a desert people or more of a mountain people. And I would argue the Apaches were a little more of a mountain people.
right.
The sense of like they did hunt elk in those mountains, and they didn't farm as much as like the Pima and the Tohono O'odham were more farmers and desert, like gatherers.
Well,
Yeah,
you had like you're saying, like you had those like valleys, and then you have those mountains because like people don't really like they forget that how high that desert is down in those areas, like the elevation as well as the how many mountains there are even. Like you're saying, so you kind of get, yeah, like those different kind of cultures and even the blend of those cultures. Because like the Navajo, for example, yeah, they grew a lot of corn. They had sheep farms on those cliffs up in the Monument Valley and stuff. And then from there, I'll go north and we'll talk Great Plains a little bit. And you have your Montana, you have your Wyoming, your North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska. And that's kind of the northern part of the plains when you group them together, northern. And then you got your Kansas, your Oklahomas, your Missouris. Um,
like you could say Texas is Southern Plains as well, a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, the problem is there's not a lot of tribes in Texas for how big it is. Like I feel like that was another one of those countries, and we had this conversation earlier about like how Mexico kind of just tried to wipe out its native people. Like there's no reservations down there. Like it just tried to wipe them out.
Mm.
And Texas was its own country at one point, as well as it was a part of Mexico at one point during those periods in
I
history.
I think Texas should almost be its own podcast because of what it was. How
And,
complicated. Yeah.
and it will be one day on this podcast topic. We're going to put it down on the thing because I think you're absolutely right. It's interesting because of like how the native culture was involved there as well. But from there, you know, and I kind of call that area, when you call the Southern Plains, if you really break down the Oklahoma area, because Oklahoma's kind of unique in its own way. But a lot of those tribes in Kansas and Nebraska, like lower Nebraska, Missouri, those kind of ones, Iowa, they kind of have those connections to Oklahoma, like the Haskell University and the tribes there. It's a lot of like sister tribes and stuff
Well,
like
and like with work being at these powwow events the last few months, right? Like right away, just you hear someone talk and you're like, oh, they're from Oklahoma, just
right.
by the way they talk. Like it's
That
closer to the South, and like it has that twang, right? Like,
Well, and exactly, and it's interesting how when you start looking at these regions where people kind of travel in the smaller region within like if you talk about the Northwest, Southwest Plains, wherever, like within that region, and then the regions bordering, like you're saying, like an Oklahoma region person will go to like a Denver March powwow as well as like a gathering of nations on a regular basis, but not necessarily go to a Stanford powwow on a regular basis because it's over in the California area. But you have like those California natives. But California is also interesting because you get into the urban areas with the Indian Relocation Act, which is a whole episode of its own, probably a series. Um, and right now we're just talking regions, but from there, I guess we'll go over to the Great Lakes. You have your Minnesota, your Michigan, your Wisconsin, kind of Ohio, Indiana. You start kind of getting into the interesting with those tribes, especially down in like not necessarily on the Great Lakes, those tribes.
right.
Um, because again, that's another part of the country where a lot of tribes were wiped out in many ways and with many atrocities. I mean, there's still people there. There's still some like state recognized tribes, not as many federal tribes kind of in that Midwestern, middle USA, South kind of area.
Well, and a
Uh,
lot of them obviously were removed to Oklahoma too. So it's like the Ohio, Indiana ones are interesting because there are some folks still there.
right,
Cleveland was a relocation
right.
city in the origin of AIM and all that. So
Right. Well, exactly. And you have Chicago too up in that area. So you have like the urban populations, and then you have, like you're saying, the Oklahoma populations that like got pushed there. So you don't really have like governing native land or governing native bodies in this area, which is interesting. The Great Lakes area, though, you do. Uh
yeah.
up in that. But like in this other area, you kind of don't. So they get kind of grouped into, I think, the larger eastern section, which is basically you hear like it's basically like the east over.
The whole eastern United States.
And I
Yeah.
look at that and I'm like, well, I like to break that down into the Northeast because you have like the New England tribes. New York's kind of its own unique thing, especially when you look at like upstate New York. And then you get into like even you could consider some of those Iroquois tribes like part of the Great Lakes in a
Yeah.
way, but they're
But
almost yeah,
the ones that were part of that confederacy in New York, the Seneca, Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Iroquois one, like we're just like Iroquois, New York, like that's how we refer to those six groups, right? Like
right. And they're large groups.
they
And
are, they are.
I kind of consider them in that Great Lakes area because of just like the culture around those Great Lakes that those tribes offered. But you can also throw them in that Northeast because of like a state of how the state of New York is, because it's kind of different. You don't really have the tribes in Pennsylvania. You have ones in like Rhode Island and Massachusetts, but they're very kind of urban in those ways, just based on how the East Coast was developed.
Well, and they're small too, like some of those ones in Virginia and that mid-Atlantic as well that are it's interesting with them that all
Right.
the and then like we always like point out like the kind of the big three areas in the East we always say are like the Iroquois groups in New York, the like Eastern Cherokee, North Carolina, and
Right.
like your Seminoles in Florida. Those are kind of like we call them the big. I don't know if you call them the big three, but then there's the smaller groups in between, right? Like
I right. And I
how
kind of
my
like
mind thinks of it
the
anyway.
the big three in the East in that sense because you're right. Like even the tribes up in Maine are kind of small.
Yeah.
And the organizations are just set up different where it's like out the regional organizations out west that you have like the Portland area Indian Health Board, the Chief Seattle Club, like the way they've kind of set up. I mean, not to say that the East doesn't have that, there's a native restaurant in Rhode Island,
Right.
but when you're looking at these larger cultural groups who really have like an effect and role on the local politics, even in the areas like the Seminoles have big pull down in Florida.
Oh yeah.
Or Iroquois have big pull up in upper New York with some of the stuff that, if they want to oppose something, they can get the people to back them. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
especially like land stuff. And then you're right, like when you look at that North Carolina, the Cherokee, you could argue kind of the Lumbee as a state tribe are kind of loud, but in that regard where like they make noise. But yeah,
Really, that's why we're considering North Carolina, like, that's Indian country. You have enough natives there with, like, with the Lumbee and Eastern Cherokee. It's like there's a significant population there. It
right.
get forgotten about a little bit, but
No, and it's good to have, and it's good to see that those populations are doing well. It's just, because like you look at like Louisiana, you look at like I'm trying to think. You have I'm blanking. I'm
oh,
blank
you're talking about the
the
Homa,
Huma, and then there's the other one. And
Chinimacha.
Kiamacha, yes, thank you. I knew it started with a C. Those two tribes down there, like they're just smaller. They're just smaller tribes, but they're there. They're living in the bayou. They're present. You know what I mean?
Oh,
So
they were very, like, it's funny you brought that up. Hurricane Katrina, right?
right,
Heard a lot of, and this is in no disregard to the Black community, but you heard the voices of the Black community when Hurricane Katrina. But what
right,
about all those tribes that got hit along that Louisiana coast? Some of them had to rebuild their whole community. Some are only
exactly,
state recognized. The
exactly.
ocean rising has affected those groups.
And they didn't. Yeah, some of them aren't like you're saying. They're not federally. When you say they're state recognized, that means they're not federally recognized. And I kind of like where the conversation's headed now because you're kind of right. There's some terminology here that we're using that not everyone might understand. And part of that is like federally recognized tribes are tribes that the federal government said, yes, we recognize you as a tribe. You are basically a sovereign nation. Here are your rights because you signed treaties with us. Going back to treaties, those are the only things signed between native tribes in the US, as well as things that, other entities at war, countries, like you sign different treaties, the Treaty of Versailles, et cetera, and part of that is establishing the native land as federal land, part of the agreements of what the US and tribes have come to. So each tribe has different treaty laws and rights because of what they agree to based on each treaty. Like the Little Shell, for example, we're tied into a treaty signed at Turtle Mountain in North Dakota. So there's just various little things like that
Yeah.
come, like you hear like the Treaty of Laramie.
Yeah, ours is Fort Laramie. So,
Yeah,
you
which
guys,
is it involves a lot of tribes.
oh, several,
But that's also why certain tribes can come hunt bison in Yellowstone. Is the Fort Laramie Treaty as well? That Colville tribe, or I might be thinking of a different one.
no, yeah, it's the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho. I think yeah, those three. It's the one with the Black Hills is ours, like that with a little bit of Wyoming and a little Eastern Montana is in that too.
Right, right. So
And,
and then there's one that the is tied into the Three Forks hunting ground, which is
yes,
all
that's like a different
also
one.
different Fort Laramie, I want to say.
Yeah, it's different.
But
That's a little further west. Yeah.
But and so that's the federal. They did that. State is they didn't necessarily have that, and but however, different states recognize. California has state recognized tribes. Like we said, the Lumbee are a state recognized tribe. And that's just like how the state of Virginia says, like, yep, we recognize you and we'll treat you that way. Different state exemptions. They're not exempt from different federal things or different federal laws and rules that apply to Indian nations. In the US.
On treaties, I wanted to hit on something you said a little bit ago. For the viewers, treaties under the Constitution are the law of the land. Treaties with Indian nations in particular.
Right.
But well, that's law, but like how many times has that been broken? How many,
Right.
right? And this is where the native lawyers argue this, for hunting rights and it's like, but states really have not acknowledged.
Right. No, exactly. And there's various different levels of the bureaucracies of like this treaty means we can do this, so you're giving us health care, so you're paying us this. But then when it comes to land, you're saying no, we're taking it. And that's where, yeah, like you said, you bring in a lawyer and these guys got to fight it out because it's treaties have been broken since day one. And if you ever ask a native to trust the federal government, they're just going to laugh at you because they've been trusting them for years as as a joke.
Or
But
like signing papers too with the old ones. Like, don't like signing papers very much.
exactly, no, you're exactly right. It's interesting. It really, and they sticking needles in kids, with vaccines back in the day, just various different things that like, you know, from boarding schools, all of it. Man, you're just getting me go down a rope, but we're not going to talk about. We're going to talk about the native land because we brought up native land and we talked about different tribes and kind of these tribal regions. So I want to talk to you about the definition, the difference, because you'll hear people talk about reservations, you'll hear them talk about rancherias, pueblos, Alaska villages and corporations, native trust lands, Oklahoma tribal statistical areas, and Indian colonies. And each one of these are just different aspects of Indian country. And kind of when you talk about like, oh, natives live on a reservation, they off a reservation, it really depends on where they're at in the world. Because like half of the tribes are located in Alaska, and none of them, there's not a single reservation out there, you know? So when you look at it, we talk about rancherias, right? There's 59 of them today. They're in California. It's a Spanish term for small Indian settlements. Rancherias are a particular California institution. A small area of land was set aside around an Indian settlement to create a rancheria. Some rancherias developed from small communities of Indians formed on the outskirts of American settlements who were fleeing Americans or avoiding the removal to reservations. With passage of Public Law 83-280 in the mid 1950s, terminating federal supervision and control over California tribes, some 40 rancherias lost the right to certain federal programs, and their lands no longer had the protection of federal status. In 1983, a lawsuit resulted in restoring federal recognition to 17 rancherias, with others still waiting for the reversal of their termination. And that's kind of referencing the state recognized tribes there in California. So a lot of these tribes, and you meet these people, man, they're native as hell.
And arguably being at that Stanford powwow, I was like, man, some of these California natives are kind of militant. They're
Very much.
hardcore.
But you're talking the 80s. That's like when I look at my dad, that's when he's growing up, is in the 80s there, right? So you're talking like my grandpa and stuff, like things in their lives happening, like being taken away, taken off roles, this and that. And that's a whole nother thing.
Well,
Uh,
and I wanted to say on Rancheria, so for the viewers, I looked this up. The smallest tribal community in the United States is in California. It's called the Chicken Rancheria, and they are Miwok Indians. They're east of Sacramento, up in the foothills of the Sierras. And yeah, 15 tribal members.
wow, that's a whole family.
I mean, they might be more now, have a few kids, and it's like,
Right. But
it's like two families or something left.
But
But
that's like what you're saying is they're the Miwok people, right? And it's interesting because you look at like just Manifest Destiny and how the white man really tried to wipe out natives and creating even just different names like that. Where you live at the Chicken Rancheria, not you're a Miwok of this branch, like the Chippewa over here, they in a way, make you different, single you out to get rid of you versus give you a way to unite. Oh, all these pueblos have the same name, all these rancherias have the same.
yeah, no, I argue they're probably not chickens if they fought for 15 people still around, like they probably
Yeah,
dealt with the gold miners and everything.
but you take the numbers of some of those California tribes and what they've like gone through, like you're talking thousands of people down to 15. You know what I mean? Like that's crazy. Another one we're going to get into is Pueblo. So you'll hear Pueblos. Most of them, the majority of them, I believe 19 of them are in New Mexico. There's 21 in total. On the Central Spanish Meseta, in the unit of settlement was as the pueblo, which is to say a large nucleated village surrounded by its own fields with no outlying farms, separated from its neighbors by some considerable distance, sometimes as much as 10 miles or so. The demands of agrarian routine and the need for defense, the simple desire for humane society, and the vast solitude dictated that it should be so. Nowadays, Pueblo might have the population running into the thousands. Doubtless, they were much smaller in the early Middle Ages, but we should probably not be far wrong if we think of them as having populations of some hundreds. I would argue some of those, like you go up to Mesa Verde, man, you can get into the thousands in those Pueblo villages too.
Right.
But basically, they're the farms, the farming native communities in the valleys in the Southwest. You have some in Arizona as well as Texas, but mainly in the New Mexico area.
Right.
Uh, like Taos Pueblo, if you want to Google one real quick, Taos Pueblo is kind of a famous one you see, kind of for its architecture. It's the adobe houses living on top of one another. So essentially, when these lands were set aside, they were set aside basically like you're already kind of living here. We're just going to give you that land.
Well, Taos is the longest inhabited village within the continental United States.
Oh wow.
And so, yeah, like Zach was saying, the farm, I mean, they lived kind of along the Rio Grande, more in the northern part of New Mexico. Very, very unique to that region, arguably. Very like,
Yeah. But it makes sense too when you talk about the weathers in that region, the high desert, the winters as well as the summers, and some of those like Taos gets snow. You're at 7,000 feet, you know,
yeah,
like it's crazy. Another one is Indian reservation. They're called reserves up in Canada. It's an area of land held and governed by the US federal government, recognized Native American tribal nation, whose government is semi-sovereign. So when you hear the sovereignty, right, this tribal, so it's semi-sovereign because of the regulations passed by the US Congress and administered by the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs and how they regulate the tribe. So there's 574 federal recognized tribes, and they govern 326 Indian reservations. So not all the tribes have a reservation. Some of the tribes share a reservation. When you talk like Shoshone and Arapaho sharing the Wind River, some of them have different councils that govern. They have different terms: council member, chief, chairman, different terminologies they may use. While some share reservations and others have no reservation at all, historical piecemeal land allocations under the Dawes Act facilitated sales to non-Native Americans, resulting in some reservations becoming severely fragmented or checkerboarded, as we like to call it, with pieces of tribal land privately held and land being treated separately as separate enclaves. The jumble of private and public real estate creates significant administrative, political, and legal difficulties. I've heard people in Wolf Point will get pulled over in their police car or by like a Montana Highway Patrol, and they'll say, "I want a tribal cop," and the Highway Patrol can't do anything because essentially a tribal cop has authority over a tribal citizen on tribal land. So there's all sorts of just loopholes and bullshit that comes of it. So reservations are interesting. That's kind of one of the most common ones you see. The next common one I would argue is the Alaska Corporation or Village. In 1971, the US Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, divided Alaska into 12 geographic locations. Alaska Natives then organized a regional corporation for each region. Those corporations were authorized to select lands that would become their fee simple property. Each region also contains a numerous small village corporations, about 225 in all. The village corporations selected the surface lands around their villages. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act required every corporation to be organized under Alaska law. In addition, a 13th regional corporation was subsequently formed for non-resident Alaska natives. So there's these different basically business corporations that operate the land, the waterways, the oil rights, the different things. So when you hear about AFN and you hear about these corporations leaving the Alaska Federation of Natives Conference and their different organizations up there, it's a lot larger because these corporations are made up of all those little tiny villages, and all those little tiny villages are in these corporations, and they have different policies of who's elected leaders and that vary between each one as well.
Alaska is very unique in that way. I did want to say There actually is one reservation in Alaska, and it's in the southeast part of Alaska.
It makes sense where it would be.
Yeah, and it's small. I think it's called EAC, Indian Reservation, but they're like similar to Oklahoma in that sense, where you're probably getting into that next, but with the Osage being the one reservation, right? And
How they
it's
kind of got pushed there. Yeah.
seeing like the histories on those, but yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. The Oklahoma tribal statistical area, right? So when you hear about Oklahoma, the land of dumping the natives, exactly, there's one reservation, the Osage. And that movie, Killers of the Wildflower Moon, is
Killer
coming.
the Flower Moon.
Flower Moon.
Flower,
No,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
That one's coming out. It's about the Osage. It looks really good, and that has some history in the sense of how it's tied to the formation of the Osage Nation. But when you get into Oklahoma tribal statistical areas, it is a statistical entity identified and delineated by federally recognized American Indian tribes in Oklahoma as part of the U.S. Census Bureau's 2010 census and ongoing American Community Survey. Many of these areas are also designated tribal jurisdictional areas, areas within which tribes will provide governmental services such as health and other like recreation, even you'll see like a health center, um, such as the Osage Nation of Oklahoma, not listed below, in the allotment was broken up, and as a consequence of their residents are a mix of native and non-native people, with only tribal members subject to the tribal government. At least five of these areas, those so-called the five civilized tribes of Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, the five tribes of Oklahoma, which cover 43% of the area of the state, including Tulsa, are recognized as reservations by federal treaty and thus not subject to state law or jurisdictional for tribal members. So it's just a different law, different ways of how things are, because you have normal people, not I should say normal people, that's fucked up
You have a
way,
lot of non-names.
but non-natives, whites, not normal U.S. citizens not dealing with the native process.
Right.
It's interesting.
Well, Oklahoma, I mean,
That's
Oklahoma has such a history of like racial discrimination. And I mean, in the black community is fairly good size there as well with the Tulsa race riot. So you tie that in and it's like, it's got a wild history.
No, it really it's interesting because like you said, there's the one reservation, but there's all this tribal land area and these tribal offices and tribal organizations that are spread throughout and kind of all over in these areas too, and the tribal members spread out. The last one kind of that we get into is the Indian colonies. There's 16 of those. Most of them are in Nevada. An Indian colony is a Native American settlement associated with an urban area. Although some of them became official Indian reservations, they differ from most reservations in that they are placed where Native Americans could find employment in mainstream America. Many were originally formed without federal encouragement or sanction, so they began without that. Indian colonies are especially common in Nevada, as the Great Basin ecosystem is very fragile native lifeways because of the untenable soon after as native lifeways became untenable soon after white settlement due to livestock overgrazing, water diversion, and the felling of the pinon pine groves. At that time, there were few official reservations in the area, and those were terribly run even by contemporary standards. Many Native Americans chose instead to seek jobs in white ranches, farms, and cities. The areas in which they settled became known as Indian camps or colonies. In some cases, they owned land they settled on. In other cases, they settled on public land, starting in the early 20th century. The federal government began establishing Indian trust territories for the colonies on public land. Following the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, many of the Indian colonies gained federal recognition as tribes. Many of the tribes formed this way are unusual in that they include members from different nations. For example, Reno Sparks Indian Colony has members with Washoe, Paiute, and Shoshone heritage.
Yeah, it's interesting with the colonies there. I actually know someone who just got housing in one of those Washoe colonies around Reno.
Yeah.
Because there's several of them. There's like if you drive from Carson City, Reno, Mindenville, south of there, to the Sierra, the east side of the Sierras. They're everywhere, like these little colonies around that region. So
Right. No, it's interesting. And that's kind of when you look at Indian country, where they live, the terminologies of where they live, how they live, and kind of get into it. But again, you ask yourself, what is that question, that overall question, what is a Native American? Did you know there's a new native apparel company?
no, I did not.
It's called Shop LS 574, named after the 574 federal tribes and the Little Shell descendancy of its founders.
Wow, that's really cool, man.
It is. It is becoming a spot to order native apparel by and for natives, working with native designers and teams to help best represent Indian country.
That's awesome, dude.
For sure. Now make sure to go pick up some Native podcast swag as well as other native gear while shopping at shopls574.com.
Oh, yeah. And do not forget to use code ANP10 to save on your next order.
That's ANP10. Hey, Matt, did you know there's a tribally owned net company?
No, I did not.
Not only are they tribally owned, but Blue Ribbon Nets also creates totally sustainable products. With Blue Ribbon Nets, not only are you getting quality nets, but even eco-friendly ones as well.
That's awesome, dude.
It sure is indeed. Make sure to use code RUGAROO10 on your next Blue Ribbon Net order to save. Again, the code is RUGAROO10, RUGARU10.
I am definitely getting a Blue Ribbon Net now.
Tune in every Tuesday to hear your favorite Native podcast.
That's right. A Native podcast has new episodes every week, ranging from boarding schools to Indian child welfare.
Not only that, but we have Indian country covered from Maine to California and Florida to Alaska, Hopi to Blackfeet and Choctaw to Tlingit, and all those Crees in between.
And all you other natives and non-natives out there, we want to remind you to tune in this Tuesday to A Native podcast.
Is your res runner in need of new lights? Well, look no further than our friends at Oxteo, an industry leader in LED lights. Make sure to use code RUGAROO on your next set of lights. That's RUGARU. And now, music on A Native Podcast with Matt and Zach. This week's song is brought to you by Taboo of Black Eyed Peas, Tony Duncan, Perry Shaviers, PJ Vegas, Kara Hodges, MC1, Dreezus, Superman, Gerald Danforth, Spencer Battiest, Doc Battiest, and My Verse. Martin Sensimir, Bethany Yellowtail, Leah Thunder Voice Eagle, Shalane Joseph, Trimus Lane, Gina Tiger, Indigenous Enterprise, and Jacasa Media Group. Stand up, stand in rock, no dapple.
They call it a pipeline, but those on the front lines know that black snake was sent for us to grow, to shed the skin our ancestors pray, of wounds old and calloused, so that we may stay, so that we may unite, unity our tool. No weapons are found in this court of rule. Men becoming ki'ai, steadfast in their guard, protecting women's hearts as their song become roots, roots to cast out healing for all sentient beings, to honor sacred mother, heart forward we heal. The salmon will run, the Mauna will breathe, the rivers will flow. The rainbow is here and prophecy tells us all generations will hear.
First Nations and our people that been living here for thousands of years. Stand up. We've been fighting for our freedom since the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria. Stand up. Like Geronimo, Sitting Bull, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, Leonard Peltier. Stand up. Now they poisoning the waters for our sons and our daughters, so we on the frontier. We won. One nation, one cause, one people, one tribe. Now it's us against the pipeline. Get on your feet for Standing Rock, and we'll show you how strong we could be when we unify.
To all my native people, recognize yourself, keep your head up. To all my tribal people, recognize yourself, keep your head up. To all my native people, to all the original people, to all my indigenous people, recognize yourself, keep your head up. Stand up, 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 stand up.
planet Earth, it's been spinning. We've been living and dying, but giving birth, the first of many nations. Celebrating them days when all that got made came after what God made. These days we cater to these internet memes, internet streams. It seems them streams aren't clean. We need the whole story seen. We're hassling before water has gasoline in it. Malcolm X moment, Martin Luther King with a dream and war boning. Wounded knee plus Alcatraz, doggone it. This is for the rock, with prayers we stand on it.
Oh yeah, we playing on it, the earth we camp on it. In a sweat lodge singing our songs with grandfathers. Heat rocks all in the spot, we splash on them with a beatbox from my boy, we jam on it. Said a prayer for the black snake killers. Praying on the front lines, they you're the realest. Stand for your people, stand for your family. Stand with Standing Rock, stand for humanity. Hey.
It takes a group of people who actually care about, Mother Earth and life and water being sacred and the land being sacred to say, we stand up.
To all my native people, recognize yourself, keep your head up. To all my tribal people, recognize yourself, keep your head up. To all my native people, to all the original people, to all my indigenous people, recognize yourself, keep your head up. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Stand it up, stand it up.
Mini Wachoni, water is life.
Mini Wachoni.
Water is life.
Water is life. Water is life.
Water is life.
I stand with Standing Rock. I stand with Standing Rock.
I stand with Standing Rock. Stand up.
Stand up.
Stand up.
Stand up.
I stand with Standing Rock. Stand up.
To all my native people, woke up the giant, we won't go quiet. To all my tribal people, don't mistake our peace as we stand defiant. To all my native people, it's the calm before the storm and I can hear it coming. To all my tribal people, I'm ready for the battle when we ain't running.
Stand up, stand up, stand up, stand up. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Stand it right, stand it right. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Stand it right, stand it right.
Standing rock, we're standing feet as history is on a sad repeat. Is it liberty or we just acting free as our land depletes from these hands of greed? See, fate is found, how we face the hounds. Take a vow for these sacred grounds. Make a sound that'll shake them out. Say aloud what can save us now. What can save us now? Stand up.
And kind of get into it. But again, you ask yourself, what is that question, that overall question, what is a Native American? We talk about the federal status, the state status. You usually typically go to the federal status. That's kind of the like catch-all. That's kind of the accepted, I guess, terminology. And within that federal status, within that state status, even sometimes there's the blood quantum. And the blood quantum, I mean, we could dedicate a whole episode to this. I'm not going to. That's how much of your blood is American Indian or Native American. And there's a lot of history. There's a lot of negative history, positive history with this for certain people, certain tribes. I'm just going to kind of get into the definitions and examples here, and then I'll let Matt, you kind of just piggyback off kind of what I have to say here. The example, for instance, the Omaha tribe of Nebraska requires a blood quantum of 1/4 Native American descent from a registered ancestor for enrollment, while the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma has no blood quantum requirement and only requires lineal descent from a documented Cherokee ancestor listed on the Dawes rolls, a specific census roll that is still upheld racist stereotypes and blood quantum theories, and that supersedes other older rolls. And that's a whole can of worms, the Dawes rolls, when you get into the Dawes Act and all that. Others use a tiered system, with the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma using a lineal descent for general enrollment, but requiring a blood quantum of at least 1/4 for all tribal council candidates. The establishment of the blood quantum is the concept of blood quantum was not widely applied by the United States government until the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. At this time, the federal government required persons to have certain blood quantum to be recognized as Native American, and thus be eligible for financial and other benefits under treaties or sales of land. They say benefits, but just call them call them rights, but again, it's the public federal government giving you those.
Is that a joke?
Yeah. History. So here's some history. In 1705, the colony of Virginia adopted the Indian Blood Law that limited civil rights of Native Americans and persons of one half or more Native American ancestry. This also had the effect of regulating who would be classified as Native American. In the 19th century and 20th centuries, the US government believed tribal members had to be defined for the purposes of federal benefits and annuities paid under treaty resulting from land cessations. According to the Pocahontas Clause of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, a white person in Virginia could have a maximum blood quantum of 1/16 Indian ancestry without losing his or her legal status as white. So that Pocahontas Clause, so we'll get into it. The Racial Integrity Act was subject to the Pocahontas Clause or Pocahontas exemption, which allowed people with claims of less than 1/16 American ancestry to still be considered white, despite the otherwise underlying climate of the one drop rule in politics at that time. The exception regarding native blood quantum was included as an amendment to the original act in response to concerns of Virginia elites, including many of the first families of Virginia, who had always claimed descent from Pocahontas with pride, but now worried that the new legislation would jeopardize their status. The exemption stated, "It shall therefore be unlawful for any white person in this state to marry any save a white person or a person with no other admixture of blood than white and American Indian. For the purpose of this act, the term white person shall apply to the person who has no trace of whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian, but persons who have 1/16 or less of the blood of American Indian and have no other Caucasic blood shall be deemed to be white persons." While the definition of Indian and colored and variations of these were established, altered throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, this was the first direct case of which itself is being defined officially. So it goes all the way back to that when you talk about blood quantums. Yeah, go ahead if you have anything quick to say.
Yeah, I was just, when you got into benefits, I was like, I just lost it because I really, it's interesting with blood quantum because of, we'll probably get into an episode on the whole Pretendian issue and folks that aren't native claiming it for so-called benefits. But, the blood quantum is interesting. Some tribes I know have lowered their blood quantum for political purposes. The Klamath tribes in Oregon, they lowered theirs from a 16th to an 8th in the last few years because they were fighting water wars. So if you're a larger political entity, lowering the blood quantum would benefit you because they're a bigger group.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but you even take like some of tribes, it's like how before you get inbred, you know what I mean? Before we do the white thing and get inbred. No, just kidding. But that's what I mean, is like you kind of not, how many of us have had that conversation? Okay, so you're my cousin, this cousin, that cousin. Too many of you natives. I know it. So,
well, and then unfortunately. No, the other part I wanted to add real quick is like the benefits thing. Like, again, we could go in further into this another time, but people think natives get a lot of things for free.
Right.
And it's like, I don't know if you have bragging rights when you have access to Indian Health Service, because it's not always the best quality of care. It's more by obligation because of treaty, right? The tax thing, the like free school, it's like, someone might know that guy that's from one of those California tribes and gets all his school paid for and gets all the, but that's such a small percentage of Indian country that receives those things. You know what I mean?
Those are kind of those stereotypes that you're talking about. We all don't look the same. We all don't dress the same. We all don't do even our traditions the same. The Northwest has salmon culture. The Plains has a buffalo culture, right? There's all these different aspects, and when you talk even blood quantum, because people are like, well, are you enough Indian to get money? Well, that depends. Does your tribe own a casino? Do they own a profitable casino? Do they own a rock quarry? Do they own a smoke shop? Do they have museums, food stores? Are they located in an area that is around a large urban center? There's various different things that go into these enterprises, because that's what these are. These are tribal enterprises. The tribes are basically a business that own different businesses and operate and manage them. That's a government, because they're also doing the governmental stuff too. But when you talk about getting money, part of that is from those things. Killers of the Flower Moon is going to talk about how probably the Osage gets some of their checks and whatnot. That if they even get checks, I don't even know that. I got to do my research there. But that's the thing is they come from certain entities, and then you have certain tribal councils even that take advantage of those, that they don't pay out their citizens even though the tribal enterprise is making money. So there's all these different things. So when you're like, what is a Native American? It's a person living in the US who has indigenous roots. And really the only similarities that we have is we all got our commodity food on the reservation. So that's why we love that fry bread. We love to dance because they tried to take that aspect of our culture away. So that's why our powwows are strong. We love our land and we will fight for it. Standing Rock showed you that. Thacker Pass, as Matt was talking about. That's a thing coming up, keep an eye on that, or if it's passed, it's passed. But that's something that's big. We all have IHS. We all love good old Indian Health Services. They all treat us the same across the board. We all love the show Res Dogs, as they do a great job defending Indian country. And we all love one another. We love our families. We're very family-oriented people. We believe in having a healthy mind, body, and spirit, because that is huge to Indian country. That is, if you're healthy in the mind, you're healthy with your body, you're healthy everywhere else, you're living a good life, and that's one thing we need to do. Last kind of thing before I'll get us into our final words here, Matt, but I didn't talk about native trust lands. Native trust lands are those lands which the title is held in trust by the U.S. for benefit of the American Indian tribe or the benefit of American Indian individual. The Supreme Court affirmed that the trust land qualifies as a reservation if it has been validly set apart for the use of the tribes. Therefore, the land held in trust for the benefit of a federally recognized tribe would meet the definition of reservation for FDPIR purposes. However, land held in trust for an American Indian individual does not qualify for reservation. So the tribe has to own the trust land, the person can't. And that's why you had all these different buyback programs happening as well. So land is interesting. There's so many things that makes us a Native American. We kind of talked a little bit about them today. Matt, is there any kind of what makes a Native American thing hanging over your head?
No, I mean, we hit on a lot of stuff today. I think, like Zach said, we have like kind of these core, larger, almost sometimes pan-Indian things that we powwows and things that connect all of us. But I mean, you could have two tribes close to each other that have some differences. And the example I'm going to use here, I wanted to bring up, was right here in Oregon, Grand Ronde and Warm Springs. Because you could argue Grand Ronde is more of the Northwest Coast culture and Warm Springs is plateau culture. And the interesting thing is you visit these two communities, they look completely different. One's economically more well off, not going to say the word rich. The other one's not as well off, and they're referred to as the res, right? So when Zach said reservations, there's 300 and some.
They're both recognized.
Yeah, they're both federal tribes, but when we use the term res, right, we're referring to those reservation communities as the res.
And what's the different here? Like you're saying, what's the difference? That the fact that Grand Ronde had the I-5 corridor built right there in the valley right there. I mean, yes, that's your land that's getting sucked, so like it makes sense. You should be allowed to build a casino on it. Do it.
Some just got the short end of the stick in that regard, and that's all that is. I mean,
right. And we're dealing with that today.
Yeah, and it creates divides, and then you get it's a whole thing. So,
well, with that being said, my guy, I got to ask you, any final words?
I think, I think for the viewers that, are kind of learning for the first time, like most people are open-minded if you ask questions, like
Right.
from a good place and not from making assumptions like, oh, do you get money or you're enough native to go to school for free or whatever,
Right.
Um, yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to Native Americans. So
No, I like that. I like that. That's definitely something that is true.
like
And then,
you or I, like we don't mind people asking questions. Like when they're coming at us respectfully, like, yeah, like we'll educate you.
well, and it's interesting too, because I don't look native. That's something we didn't get into really today because we don't look the same, right? We're not all the red skinned, beautiful black hair men running around with our tan buckskin hides. No, we have, I have blue eyes, brown hair. There's blonde hair folk. There's red hair folk because tribes had, we were forced to assimilate. Some of us are biracial in that sense. Nothing we can do about it. We can't control what our parents did. Um, but we're here and we have that common goal of what our culture is and what that represents, and we understand that. Um, and that's part of it too, is I think we do get those questions sometimes because people don't necessarily believe us that we are, me for sure. I get that all the time. They don't believe me that I'm native, but then I
I get it depending on the time of year.
or summer you're good.
Times come in, it's like, okay, like
Right. But that's one of those questions, and I've dealt with it my whole life, and it is what it is, right? And it's always going to be there. But at the end of the day, you know who you are, you know where you come from, you know what your family values are, you know what your family taught you. And that goes for all of us in Indian country. And when you look at truly, I think those similarities, like we're talking about, that there's one that I think stands out is the love for this land, the love for our North American native land, the way to keep it right and to live with it. And that's something that we just need to keep doing. And until next time, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
I know ballers, I know chiefs, I know riders from the east. I know educated natives down to picket in the streets. Middle fingers to police, fuck you, we come in peace. I know red-skinned hippies that be giving me the creeps. I know beauty, I know beach, I know savages and freaks. And I know a couple cousins even bougier than me. No, ain't elite, bougie native, yes indeed. Art exhibit to the club, and we roll it 20 deep. Copper on my neck, gold on my ring, feather on my hat, skin stitched chin, 100 warriors on my back. They be drumming when I sing, man, there ain't no way around it.
A Native Podcast is produced by G&G Advertising and Quartz Lake Productions.